Good afternoon. This is Beth Wadham from the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, and welcome to our January webinar, Contemplative Pedagogies in Geosciences, with Jill Schneiderman, Professor of Earth Science at Vassar College. And greetings to you, Jill, from Northampton. How are things?
Little chilly here in Poughkeepsie, but happy to be here. Thank you.
Did you teach classes today, or you had
I don't teach on Wednesday, so I had a chance to compose myself and just get excited about our opportunity this afternoon.
Great. So we're delighted to be here today with Jill Schneiderman. As a professor at Vassar, she teaches earth science, courses in feminist environmentalism, gender and natural resources, and environmental justice. Jill received a Fulbright Fellowship in 2003 to research gender in relation to water resources in Trinidad and Tobago. And she was also a Smithsonian postdoctoral fellow and a Congressional Science Fellow during the Clinton years. She was granted one of our Contemplative Practice Fellowships in 2009 to develop a course about time and environmental change. Jill's most recent book is For the Rock Record, Geologists on Intelligent Design Creationism, which is about the controversy between science and religion from the perspective of geologists. She also edited and contributed to The Earth Process, Maintaining a Livable Planet, which is a collection of essays about the relevance of geology to environmental issues. Her articles and essays have appeared in Esquire, Shambhala Sun, the Journal of Coastal Research, and Women's Studies Quarterly, as well as a number of books, including the Oxford Companion to the Earth. Jill writes regularly for her blog at earthdharma.org and for Shambhala Sunspace. Thanks so much, Jill, for offering this webinar to our network, and now I'm going to hand over the presentation to you.
Thank you, Beth. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so grateful to all of you for taking an hour of your day and spending it with me. I wanted to start just by calling attention to a book that I like to read aloud to myself and sometimes to my students at the beginning of each semester. It's called This is Water. You may be familiar with it. It's a commencement address that writer David Foster Wallace gave in 2005. There is much to love in this provocative essay. In it, Wallace searches for answers to simple questions such as, how do we keep from going through adult life unconsciously, comfortably entrenched in habit? And he reveals a most basic, important decision we all make every day, how to think about the world. Called out above is a portion of his book that sometimes I think I should copy and keep at the ready. Probably the most dangerous thing about an academic education, at least in my own case, is that it enables my tendency to over-intellectualize stuff, to get lost in abstract thinking instead of simply paying attention to what's going on in front of me. In my talk today, I'd like to do two things. First, I'd like to explain my path towards contemplative pedagogy, and second, describe some of what I do as a geoscientist to help me and my students pay attention to the truths of the Earth system. And that's why I've called the webinar Contemplative Pedagogies in Geosciences. This is my first webinar, so please be patient with whatever technical difficulties might arise, though I'm hoping things will go without a hitch. In 1963, while he was president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and confined in the Birmingham City Jail, Martin Luther King, Jr. wrote a response to a published statement by 8 Alabama clergymen. King's colleagues had called his activities, that is, his coming to Birmingham at the request of an Alabama branch of the SCLC to participate in nonviolent direct action, they called it unwise and untimely, and King responded, as you see here, but though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. The question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? Perhaps the nation and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. As a contemplative geoscientist living in the Anthropocene, I'm feeling a bit like calling myself a creative extremist. For those of you unfamiliar with the term Anthropocene, it's an unofficial addition to the geologic timescale, something I'll talk about a little later. Basically, a new period name that recognizes the profound effect of human beings on the planet. I think it's not too far a stretch to think that the Earth and all the beings who live here might benefit from some creative extremism. Maybe creative extremism is the skillful response to lustful living in our current age. Looking at the mission statement here of the college where I teach, I also seem to find some license for creative extremism in the quote here. Vassar seeks to develop in its students recognition of different kinds of knowledge and their scope and relevance to one another. Development of the powers of reason and imagination through the use of all our human resources to speculate, to feel, to inquire boldly, to enjoy, to change, to create. Not only have I found the license for this creative extremism in the college's mission statement, I've also found some funding for it. Now, perhaps extremism is really too exciting a word. Really what I mean to say is that as a scientist, I have been supported by the college in my work to help a diverse array of students, as possible, a diverse array of students come to know and appreciate the planet, particularly students who maybe not are especially inclined to science, some who are particularly artistic, spatial, visual learners. We have many of them where I teach. Before I describe some of the contemplative practices I've adopted in my geoscience courses, I'd like to tell you how I had occasion to develop them. And the person you see pictured here is Vassar class of 36, Carolyn Grant Fay. She is a dance movement therapist and co-founder of the C.J. Young Educational Center in Houston. And in 2000, she established an endowment to, in her words, establish new paradigms for education to meet the needs of 21st century scholars and students by engaging the intellect, the imagination, and the body in integrative ways inside and outside the classroom. None of what I'm going to describe today would have occurred if it weren't for the funding from Vassar College's Carolyn Grant Endowment Fund, as well as the encouragement and the support that I get from colleagues who are involved in the endeavors of the Carolyn Grant initiative. So how does this relate to me as a geoscientist? Well, here's a geological photo that will help me explain. This spectacular image was taken in September of 2011, and it shows the active lava lake in Hawaii at Pu'u'o'o Crater. It illustrates a phenomenon that I've been captivated by and about which I try to teach my students. It shows the almost incomprehensible change from a more than 1,200-degree fluid basaltic lava to a hard solid in mere moments. How does this happen? I understand theoretically how this occurs because I can read diagrams like the one before you. It's a diagram that shows the phases, that is the specific forms of any material, under different pressure and temperature conditions. You see temperature on the x-axis, pressure on the vertical axis, realms of different phases in different areas. For those of you who aren't scientists, let me just remind you that the most familiar phases are solid, liquid, and gas. Any phase of a material is identical in composition and structure in all parts of that phase. For example, a glass of water is the liquid phase of H2O from top to bottom. If it weren't, we'd call it something else, like ice if it had a different structure, or lemonade if it had a different composition, like lemon and sugar dissolved in it. At a stable pressure, a liquid in the light blue zone, designated by the blue cross, experiences a decrease in temperature and moves along a horizontal line in space towards the green area. It freezes. It crosses, say at point D, crosses the black line, and then it becomes a solid. Now this is a rather dry scientific explanation, yet the process produces some beautiful forms. In the top photo, you see what's called Pele's hair. Thin strands of volcanic glass drawn out from molten lava and named for the Hawaiian goddess of volcanoes, depicted in the lower right illustration. The strands are formed by stretching or blowing out of molten basaltic glass from lava. A single strand with a diameter of less than a half a millimeter could be as long as 2 millimeters. And Pele's tears in the lower left are small bits of molten lava quickly cooled to form glass particles shaped like spheres or teardrops. They're jet black in color and are often found on one end of a strand of Pele's hair, which is remarkable given how delicate Pele's hair seems to be. So, I applied to the Carolyn Grant Endowment for funds so that I could take glass flameworking classes at a nearby craft school and experience with my body the transformation from solid glass to liquid glass and back again. I was surprised to find it very relaxing. My teacher, a scientific glassblower and instructor at Syracuse University, told me that working with glass was all about not freaking out, and that in her opinion it was a form of meditation because it was a practice that focused my attention on the matter at hand, that is, my fingers near an intense flame mixture of oxygen and natural gas. Well, around the same time, I traveled to Tibet as the resident geologist with Asian Studies colleagues pictured here in front of the Potala Palace in Lhasa. And I was really taken by the juxtaposition of contemplative traditions at this geological roof of the world. When I came back and I was talking with one of my Vassar colleagues on the Carolyn Grant Committee, I was led to the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society and its summer session on curriculum development, pictured here, and so I signed up. And there I heard Arthur Zions, the former executive director of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, pose some very interesting questions, one of them shown in this slide. The university is well practiced at educating the mind for critical reasoning, critical writing, and critical speaking, as well as for scientific and quantitative analysis. But is this sufficient? In a world beset with conflicts, internal as well as external, isn't it of equal, if not greater importance, to balance the sharpening of our intellects with the systematic cultivation of our hearts? He urged the participants to think about how we as educators might help our students have a fresh experience of a phenomenon or an object. He asked, what paths are there on the journey to a fresh experience? One path he suggested on the journey to a fresh experience of a phenomenon or object was the route of what he called sustaining contradictions. Arthur mentioned one of my favorite contradictions, the wave-particle duality, and how physicists had to sustain this contradiction to do their work. He also mentioned the point at infinity as a contradiction sustained by mathematicians. Listening to him made me think of a rugged landscape in northern Pakistan that I helped map in 1990 near Nanga Parbat. It's a geologically dynamic region that is both rising up and wearing down simultaneously. Quite a contradiction, simultaneous uplift and erosion. It's a process that was noticed in the late 18th century by James Hutton, the person who is considered the father of geology. We were studying this mountain belt that was created by the collision of Asian and Indian lithospheric plates beginning 60 million years ago, and we asked questions like, how does continental lithosphere form? How are continents assembled? How are they reworked and deformed? Breathing laboriously at the highest altitudes on Earth while stepping gingerly over unstable talus slopes. As geologists doing the field work, it seems to me that we were physically sustaining contradictions. Arthur urged us to contemplate the idea that every discipline has a contemplative dimension. It made me wonder, what is the contemplative heart of earth science? How might earth science be related to the tree of contemplative practices pictured here and available on the Center's website, with its deep roots of connection on the lower left and awareness on the lower right? Well, if you ask geologists what they would consider to be at the heart of our discipline, I bet a great majority would eventually come round to the idea of geologic time. The geologic column is pictured here, somewhat unspectacularly when considering the fanfare it really should generate. It includes the names of the periods of time in Earth history and absolute age dates that correspond to the major transitions from Precambrian time to Paleozoic to Mesozoic to Cenozoic. One of the misleading aspects of this depiction is that the Precambrian, in red, actually accounts for 87% of all of geologic time. Knowing that, the diagram provides another example of how I think geologists pursue science while sustaining yet another contradiction, the contradiction of the simultaneity of stasis and change over the fullness of geologic time. The idea that the Earth is 4.57 billion years old is an intellectually hard to conceive of span of time. What's more, for most of that time span, it has been populated most successfully by single-celled creatures that have survived an oxygen-poor atmosphere, acidic oceans, meteorite bombardment, the closing and opening of oceans, and fluctuating temperatures. It's now being changed relatively abruptly by a late-on-the-scene hominid, hence the label Anthropocene. It seems to me that this reality requires us to carry with us at all times the contradictory phenomenon of stasis and change over geologic time. How can a planet seemingly so resilient be so vulnerable to the actions of an organism so new on the planetary scene? Here's a metaphor in front of you that emphasizes the point. A 24-hour clock standing in for 4.57 billion years of Earth history. Earth is born at midnight. The first life, simple single-celled organisms, appear at 4 a.m. The atmosphere becomes rich enough in oxygen to form iron oxide minerals not until 6 a.m. At 2 in the afternoon, complex single-celled organisms come around. Those seemingly ancient bug-eyed trilobites don't show up until after 9 p.m. Just a slightly more than a moment before the end of the day, humans appear. Wow. This is the contradiction I live with every day and that I want more than anything else to impress upon my fellow Earthlings. So, I applied for and fortunately received one of the contemplative practice fellowships that the center offered so that I could explore more fully ideas about geologic time and the heart of contemplative geoscience. One of the first things I did with my time as a contemplative practice fellow was make a geological pilgrimage of sorts to this site, Sycamore Point in Scotland. It's this very spot that allowed James Hutton, once again the founder of modern geology, to conclude that the Earth showed no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. Here, I'm kneeling on what's called an unconformity. It's a plane of contact that represents enormous spans of time having passed, with essentially nothing to show for it but a thin plane. That is, the vertical grayish rocks in the foreground are Silurian-aged greywackies, whose composition tell us that the unit was deposited off an ancient coastline. The reddish, more horizontal rocks are Devonian-aged sandstone that tell us they were deposited above sea level. What's more, once you understand that the vertical beds below the unconformable contact were originally horizontal, the vast amounts of time required to produce this configuration jump right out at you. You realize that you're looking at a geological story that began more than 400 million years ago, that has multiple chapters and continues to this day. As part of my fellowship, I read anthropologist Lauren Eisley's The Firmament of Time. It is such a beautiful book. Here's an example of Eisley's prose and the ideas they convey. Time and raindrops. It took enormous effort to discover the potentialities of both those forces. It took centuries before the faint trickling from cottage eaves and gutters caught the ear of some inquiring scholar. They could not hear it because they lived in a time span so short that the only way geologic change could be affected was by the convulsions of earthquakes or the 40 torrential days and nights that brought the biblical deluge. I think that Eisley taps into geologists' struggles to reconcile catastrophic change with stasis. This struggle to reconcile the gradual with the catastrophic remains part of the warp and woof of geological thinking, whether applied to meteorite impacts, lithospheric plate motions, or global warming. I think it needs to become part of the wider warp and woof of societal thinking. I was so grateful to have the fellowship because these ideas just feel like an important subject of study and reflection. So my first foray into contemplative pedagogy was this reading course about deep geological time. But the course really just involved reading about time and an incorporated stillness practice. I did come up with a body scan to represent geologic time. The length of the head only, mouth, nose, forehead, scalp, encompasses the most familiar stages of evolution from fish to reptiles to mammals up to the last ice age. But this consideration of time didn't exhaust the bones, so to speak, of what I was supposed to be doing as a teacher of earth processes. What I really wanted to do was find ways to engage the mind and body in geological inquiry and also cultivate deep understanding and open awareness. So I kept breathing, and I branched out. And what I'd like to do now is explain some of the techniques that I've been trying out that I consider to be contemplative pedagogies. I've used them in my introductory level physical geology course, which is not the course for which I got the fellowship, to teach students some of the basics that are part of every geology class of this sort. The subjects of investigation circled below on the screen are the properties of minerals, sedimentary rock structures and landscape evolution, the igneous portion of the rock cycle, and chemical and mechanical weathering. All of these are important topics in an introductory geology course. The pedagogical techniques pedagogical techniques that I use are as follows. Well, contemplative seeing from the stillness practices branch of the tree, and I get that term, by the way, from my colleague Michelle Francel, who is a chemistry professor at Bryn Mawr, who inspired the approach I'll describe. I first heard her speak at the curriculum development session at the Summer Curriculum Institute that the center sponsors. So I'll talk about a contemplative seeing exercise. I'll talk about a movement practice, a kind of walking meditation practice. And I will talk about a beholding practice from the creation process branch of the tree. So let me start with this contemplative seeing exercise as a way to teach about the properties of minerals, something that all geology students learn, and that's really important if we're going to know about the Earth. Well, what I have up on the screen is the typical way that this is taught. Students are told what to look for. That is, we teach them what properties to observe and what properties to expect for each different type of mineral. So we go through in the lesson the luster, that is kind of the reflectivity, the color, the cleavage, the way the mineral breaks, the crystal form. We direct the students to look for these specific things. And then it's not unusual to give them a data sheet such as this that actually tells them when you look at the mineral scheelite, you should expect to see the following things. So I developed an alternative approach, a contemplative approach that I think Michelle Francel's phrase contemplative seeing does justice to. And by the way, this is a science course, so I don't tell them it's a contemplative practice. I just do it. I put 25 to 30 specimens on a table in the classroom, and I tell them that, in fact, there are only 5 different types of minerals here. I ask them to take their time examining, looking, really seeing what it is that's before them. I tell them that there are many different observations they can make, and I don't want to take the fun out of it by telling them what to look for. I just ask them to try to put the samples into groups that are the same solid substance. By doing this, they begin to figure out the properties of minerals and which ones are useful for identification purposes and which ones might be less than helpful. So in this image is a selection of minerals I might show them. Here in this image they're arrayed randomly, but there's fluorite, there's quartz, calcite, halite, and gypsum. So the students would get these samples and then they would start to group them. And they might group them according to color and say maybe this is a useful property for distinguishing between different kinds of minerals. Or they might group them according to the crystal form and say, is this a useful property for gathering like minerals? Here they are actually grouped according to mineral identity. Calcite is in the upper left, quartz in the upper right, gypsum in the lower left, fluorite in the middle, and halite in the lower right. They learn that color is not very useful as a property for identifying minerals. They learn that crystal form is helpful, but that cleavage, the way a mineral breaks, is essential. I need to listen to where they are when they make their observations. I want to be able to tell them that really learning how to see clearly will really help them think. The next contemplative approach is one that helps me teach students about sedimentary rock structures and landscape evolution. Here's an example of the traditional way that this is taught. Students are given a field trip road log, and they're driven from one stop to the next and told what they should look for, what they should see at the stop. So they get this handout, we're going to go to this particular park, this is the location of it, there's some picnic benches, there's a nice view, and what you can see when you look at the outcrop is interbedded sandstone. Okay, that's not particularly inspiring way to approach discovery, in my opinion. It's So an alternative contemplative approach that I came up with is that of applying the walking meditation, open awareness kind of movement exercise. And again, I don't tell them this is a contemplative practice. I just take them to one location where they can walk in silence and practice mental noting in order to make field observations. In some way, field observations are the bare bones of geology. But all too often, geologists take students to outcrops and tell them what they should see. So in this open awareness exercise, I ask them to follow their curiosity, notice something, and try as best as they can to stay with the phenomenon or object that they are trying to see. This year I took them to the place pictured here, the walkway over the Hudson River. It affords opportunities to see glacially carved U-shaped valleys now occupied by the Hudson River, sedimentary rocks and structures in outcrops along the banks of the river, erosion processes, fluid flow. And since this landscape is always changing, from year to year, season to season, the classes of students I take there are likely to make observations that are different from one another. And that really keeps me working on my open awareness. On the walk back, I let the talking and discussion happen. It's a little over a mile walk. They have ample opportunities to point out and interpret the features that they noted on the first crossing. Last year, I was fortunate enough to take my sedimentology students to Big Bend National Park. There, we moved back into the stillness of deep geologic time, into this landscape that the rocks told us was once a shallow sea. We could see it there in the layered, sometimes fossiliferous limestones. Now I want to move on to the next, the last third contemplative practice, which might be called a creation process practice. I've heard it called beholding in other contexts. And it's a practice that I've been able to use in order to help students understand something about the igneous portion of the rock cycle. Again, a critical thing that people need to understand, that students need to come to terms with when they're studying geology. Now, this is how the rock cycle is usually taught. The igneous portion is detailed as a glowing orange circle, designated magma. It's conceptual and theoretical. Solid goes to liquid, liquid goes to solid again at different temperatures depending on composition with different viscosities, that is, different degrees of flowiness. But with simple apparatus in the lab, they can behold the phase change from solid to liquid and back again in this creation process practice. Now I'm going to show you a short video of an artist who is working with glass, and I have this apparatus set up in my lab, and this glass artist from California is going to demonstrate the melting of glass. I'm going to make this a wider screen for you to see. He's placing this glass in a torch flame that's made up of oxygen and natural gas. And I have my students have a chance to do this. They get to play with the glass just like he's doing there. They see it begin to heat up because they can see the color change. They feel it begin to heat up because the rod gets soft and they're able to push the glass together and manipulate it. They experience this magical transformation rather quickly. You saw how quickly it happened in the video. Sometimes it happens so quickly that the low viscosity, that is the high liquidity of the glass, causes it to drip and form Pélé's tears. Sometimes they put the glass too quickly into the flame, and that rapid temperature causes an explosion of the glass because of the rapid expansion that they experience. There are so many things to experience and to see when one is doing this simple activity. Now, me, I'm partial to playing as he is doing right now with that molten glob. I like to feel different degrees of viscosity, that is stickiness. I like to see how the viscosity fluctuates with changes in temperature, and I like to experiment by taking the rod of glowing glass, taking it out of the flame, feeling it gets sticky. And I feel that in some way that's not intellectualized, I am transported to a place that allows me to really understand in some bodily, physical way the changes that happen when a rock melts and turns into a magma. Okay, so as we're getting back to where we left off, I'd like to show you this image which explains a bit about how the glass melting happens. I won't take very much time with it, but let me just say that one other thing that I have the students do is experiment with melting different compositions of glass, because as you can see in the image, glass 1 melts at a higher temperature and glass 2 melts at a different temperature. These are glasses that are made up of different compositions, so they come to understand that the composition of a substance affects the temperature at which it melts. And it also helps them to understand these, what you see displayed before you, these binary phase diagrams, which are central to the field of igneous petrology, that is, the study of the formation of igneous rocks, something that students often look at and their eyes glaze over. The last creation process practice, or practice of beholding, that I want to describe that I use is for teaching about chemical and mechanical weathering of rocks. Well, the question here is, how does this happen? How do mountains like the Himalayas in the upper left turn into mountains, if you can call them that, of the Appalachians in the lower right? We usually intellectualize the process. We articulate the two types of phenomena that have to happen: the physical disintegration, that is the breakup of a rock into smaller fragments, and also the internal structure, the chemical weathering, the internal structure of a mineral getting changed by the removal or the addition of elements. So it's a combination of chemical and mechanical processes. And so we can articulate that in words and we can show the pictures, but here was an idea that I got that's a lot sweeter, and I got it from a mindful eating exercise at the Garrison Institute. I give the students a candy bar of this sort to suck on, but not chew, and I ask them to see what happens. Of course, the chocolate and the caramel dissolve, and they are left with nothing but the nuts. They have to chew those to digest the whole thing, and then they can easily make the leap to chemical and physical weathering. So just to summarize then, you have before you this diagram I've showed a couple of times with the tree of contemplative practices, the different kinds of pedagogical branches and the subjects that I try to illuminate using some of those branches. I do also teach a course on earth science and environmental justice, and I use a variety of contemplative practices in that seminar, but that's a tale for a whole other time. So I'm just going to end by bringing it back to the visionaries that I started with, Martin Luther King and David Foster Wallace. Again, in his letter from Birmingham jail in 1963, Martin Luther King wrote, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. To me, the Earth system is that network of mutuality." David Foster Wallace wrote, "The only thing that's capital T true is that you get to decide how you're going to try to see it. This, I submit, is the freedom of real education. You get to consciously decide what has meaning and what doesn't. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline and effort and being able truly to care about other people. That is real freedom. That is being taught how to think." And I guess the fellowship has helped me decide that I'm going to see the teaching of earth science in a somewhat unconventional way, perhaps, but that I am going to exercise the kind of freedom that both these individuals described. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Jill. It was wonderful. I feel like your efforts to create this fresh experience of phenomena for your students was also very rewarding for you too. And it's so interesting to think how others in other disciplines might also figure that out, that what is the heart or the contemplative dimension of the discipline. fascinating to me to see how actually embodied that heart was and how often you ended up engaging the senses. I would imagine that really generated a lot of interest and wonder among your students. So now is the time that we can start to take questions from the folks that are listening to the webinar. And I know that's one of mine is what kind of a response you got from your students, whether you noticed a difference, but we can also look and see. They're probably typing in some now, and you'll be able to select.
Okay, there, now I have it. Okay.
Great.
All right, I see a couple of questions here. Let's see. Okay.
Nice.
Okay, all right, thank you very much for these questions.
Yeah, take a moment to read them. If you select one, you can just say who it was from, and the participants won't be able to see them, so if you can read the question first before you just address it.
Okay. Well, one question here is from Jan, and Jan asks, has integrating contemplative practices into your life as an earth scientist also changed your scientific understanding of Earth? Do new qualities of understanding emerge from embodied experience that are communicable back to conceptual earth sciences? Well, that's a question, a good, very interesting question, and I mean the answer to that is very much yes. Integrating contemplative practices into my life as an earth scientist has changed my scientific understanding of the earth in ways that I think don't necessarily make more clear my scientific understanding of the earth, but in some ways put me in touch with a kind of a greater mystery in a way, because I end up, I mean, that's what I do, that's what I like to do with the writing for the Shambhala Sun Space. Like, I see things going on in the earth that are processes that somehow seem to relate to the teachings of the East, whether they're about continual change. I think about that a lot. That is, I look at the earth now and I'm able to see change in so many things that previously might have seemed inert. Like, here's a recent thing I was reading was just thinking about how minerals, things that we tend to think of as being relatively inert, silicate minerals, being relatively inert, over even pretty long time scales. Minerals were formed, a certain set number of minerals were formed when the Earth first formed, and now, 4.57 billion years later, there are so many more minerals than there were when the Earth first formed, and that's because biological life has amended the Earth, and it's created new minerals by processing the elements that the Earth offers us up. And I hadn't really, of course I'd seen change in the form of rocks going from sediments to metamorphic rocks to igneous rocks, but the idea that the Earth had essentially evolved new minerals because of the interactions is something that I think I'm much more able to see and appreciate because of the contemplative practices. Let's see what else we have here. Let's see. Kathleen asks, how did the students receive the contemplative exercises, although not named as such? Well, it's hard. It's hard because, I'm dealing with students who are, I'm fortunate in that they're accomplished and very competent and engaged, but they've also had to perform in a traditional educational context in order to come and be students at Vassar. And so it's a little unnerving for them to step outside the box, so to speak, and approach these topics in a way that is much more fluid, if you will. Like, for example, this semester, for the first time, I'm trying to teach a class on, it's basically an introductory geology class, but I'm taking Israel and its neighbors, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, as our area of investigation. So I'm trying to get students who are interested in a particular area in the world to engage with the land and the landscape, that seemed like a good place to choose because it's a relatively small area. People, the difficulties are about the land, and I am trying to get them to see the land, for what it is, shared ground. And we talk about subjects like minerals and time, not in one particular week where, okay, today, gang, we're doing minerals. Next week, we're going to do geologic time. It's a woven together thing, and I think it's a little disorienting for them. So some students are able to go with it, and others, it's just not their cup of tea.
It is unfamiliar territory, yeah, and some are more comfortable with that than others, yeah.
Let's see, what else do we have here? Let's see, this is from Grace, could you describe the connections you made between contemplative pedagogies and your environmental justice work? Sure, that's a great question. In fact, I mean, really, it was that work in many ways that moved me into the dimension of thinking about contemplative practice and contemplative pedagogies, because I had been teaching courses on earth science and environmental justice since, like, I don't know, the 1996. I got a National Science Foundation grant. I was very grateful for that, to try and integrate, to try and captivate students who cared about social justice by engaging them in ideas about the earth and how social justice related to the earth as well, how people lived on the planet. But what I found over the years was that it was a bummer for the students. The students really, they got very dejected. I mean, there's a lot to get dejected about, and that was in the late 90s. So now today, in some ways, it's even worse. And so here you have these, ordinarily hopeful, enthusiastic young people who come into your class, aflame and excited and wanting to make the world, a wonderful place for all beings, and then they're confronted with this wall of reality that can be so disheartening. And so I find that having silence in my environmental justice seminar at the beginning of each seminar, and then at the end, I turn on the UCLA or the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society websites, and we'll do a meta practice, loving kindness practice. And again, some students, it's just not their cup of tea, but I'll tell you, a lot of them feel very grateful for being introduced to the practice, and understand that in order to heal other people, you have to take care of yourself as well. So I definitely use contemplative pedagogies in those classes. Let's see, what else do we have here?
Yeah, Jill, Paul Wapner, who teaches environmental studies at American University, always said that he had to refer to his courses as Introduction to Doom to his students.
Yeah.
It's a lot to hold, that the information, and giving them some way to sit with it and observe their own reactions, as well as, what is there.
Wow, well, there are a lot of questions here, and I don't know, let's see, how much time we have. Okay. Okay. Well, here's a question. How does your approach compare to the ways in which the pioneers, Hutton and Lyle, experienced the world? Were their insights, experiences also embodied? This is from David. Well, I think that their experiences were embodied. Hutton was a gentleman farmer, if you will. He was a physician by training, but he owned a farm, and actually I went to go see his farm as part of my geological pilgrimage when I went to Sycamore Point. I tried to go everywhere that Hutton went, in Edinburgh and well, not everywhere, but many places. Anyhow, I think his experience was embodied. I mean, just the fact that he knew what the soil was and what he called the paradox of the soil, the idea that the soil needed to be able to replenish itself. I mean, he got that from being out there and putting his hands in the soil, even if it only was to see how his caretaker was doing with the work. But the other thing about Hutton, and that I think people don't necessarily remember about him, is he's remembered as the founder of geology. He's known to have had this farm, and he's known as having conceived of the Earth as he called it the world machine, an ever-cycling machine. And that's what made him go look for unconformities to know that the Earth, had a great age. But he also was a physician by training, and he didn't just talk about the Earth as a machine. He talked about the Earth as a body. And in some ways he anticipated, I think, what it was that James Lovelock has articulated in the Gaia hypothesis. And I think we're really going to increasingly come to see in the 21st century that the Earth is very much a living system, and when you get out and you are still in it and watch it, you see it as an organism. So yes, I do. I mean, Lyle, I know a little bit less about. I know he was a good rhetorician, but Hutton, I think his experiences were very much embodied, and he went out with Playfair, and they drew diagrams and went in boats and tromped all over the countryside, and I think that that's important in coming to understand the Earth.
They didn't have anybody telling them exactly what to look for.
Right.
Yeah.
They were all pretty much looking for the same thing. They wanted to find coal, and they couldn't figure out quite how to find it, and if they knew that if they could figure out where in the pile they should dig, so that's what motivated them, but nobody was telling them, it was pretty much a detective game then. Let's see, what else do we have? We have a
I see a lot of
question.
people are interested in this, the question about the student responses, and you said a little bit about that, but have there been some, and you mentioned the ones that, find it unfamiliar and are a little put off, but are there some examples where you feel like it was a good fit for students, or?
Well, I'll tell you, the Contemplating Time class that I cooked up as a result of the fellowship, which I frankly didn't have the guts to propose to the curriculum committee, I taught as an overload. That is, I had my regular teaching load, and we have the liberty of taking an overload and teaching a so-called reading course, and that appealed to me because one of the things that we've done with the Carolyn Grant money is retrofitted a beautiful space in the library as the quiet room. And there are Zafus and Zabutons in there, and I just put up a poster saying, Contemplating Time, reading course. We're going to read some Stephen Jay Gould, John McPhee, John Burroughs, Abraham Joshua Heschel, and we're gonna think about time. We listened to a couple of Dharma talks by Joanna Macy, and 17 students signed up for that class, which is a lot.
Nice.
And all we did was read these books and get together once a week and sit. We'd sit together for 45 minutes and then have a brief discussion. I mean, there were no papers. They wrote and showed me their journals afterwards, and they each got a half credit ungraded for it. But I think the fact that 17 students signed up for it, and there were always at least 12 who showed up, and all of them came to a one-day meditation retreat that was led by Rabbi Joanna Katz nearby, speaks to the fact that it definitely touches something in them. They're all either, how many times does a student come into your office and their phone rings, 3 times, or, it's just they're pulled in so many different directions that they seem to love the opportunity to integrate stillness, silence into the classroom setting. So I've really had some great experiences.
Welcome invitation, yeah.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm sitting in my office right now, and I won't go into it, but I have some comments during the environmental justice seminar. I did something that Harold Roth from Brown University had recommended, which was do a kind of a meditation lab. Mm-hmm. I did a diminished form. At the end of each class, they knew part of the deal was that I was going to ask them they would write a sheet just reflecting on anything that came to mind after we sat quietly for 5 or 10 minutes. And so I have a whole sort of chronology for each student, although they didn't all put their names on it. I said they didn't have to. But it sort of traces the evolution of their experience from silence in the first week of the semester to how they experience silence in the context of a classroom by the 14th week of the semester. And it's really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Jill, for sharing that. And if it's not too personal, I wondered whether you would talk about your own practice and how that helps you with, either identifying opportunities for research or just, a little bit about that. It's usually at the core of a contemplative teacher. There's some kind of
Well, I'm happy to talk about it, and thank you so much for asking. I could talk about it for a whole other hour, but let me just say my own practice at this point. I've been sitting regularly for 5 years, and now I don't start my day without spending 30 minutes on the cushion. I really depend on it to settle my mind, and I find that by doing so, I am so much more able to see with clarity what it is that I need to attend to. And in the classroom situation, of course that has, I think, really been positive ramifications in my life as an individual in the world. But as an educator, I find one of the biggest differences is that when a student comes to talk to me, I'm so much better able to really pay attention without distraction to what it is that to that interaction with the person and what it is that the person is. I'm much better at attentive listening, let's put it that way. So I depend on it daily, and I also usually do 2 4 to 7 day silent retreats a year. And I think the other thing that's sort of personal about it that's remarkable to me is it has made me much more attentive to the present moment in my life, and that has had ramifications for me as a scientist and as a writer, because I'm open to fortuity in a way that I was not previously open to fortuity, and so there have been some lovely connections I've made because I know I have a much more solid understanding of what's important and what matters to me, and so when something fortuitous happens that really resonates, I am able to discern, should I pay attention to my interest in that or should I not? It's much clearer to me. And so, I don't know if this is too abstract to be clear. I have an example of, I work, I spent a month last summer, and will do the same this summer, teaching earth science at a unusual summer camp called Camp Eden Village, which is a environmental camp that focuses on Judaism, social justice, and environment, and it's built around a farm. And I was completely taken when I read about what these young people who had started it were doing, and I just knew it was the right thing for me to do, to get in touch with them. And that has led me to a connection with a nurse, a young man who recently got his PhD and is interested in doing some environmental justice work in Siberia related to the health of the native people there who are suffering because of the melting of the permafrost. I know that seems maybe perhaps obscure or circuitous, but to me, it makes sense to me because of what I know matters to me.
Yeah,
so
having that compass kind of oriented. Yeah.
That's a great way to describe it, Beth. It is. It's so much a compass, and that's why the daily practice matters so much, because it's always coming back to. I'm always beginning again. I'm always returning, to that center. So.
Well, thank you so much, Jill. We're going to just take a couple minutes to thank everybody who attended and for the great questions. We had some really wonderful ones today. And I want to let people know just about the next webinar, which will be on February 23rd. We'll be having a presentation from Laura Rondon, who is Professor of Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Many people also know her as the author of Sentipensante Pedagogy, which is her book on sensing thinking pedagogy, educating for wholeness, social justice, and liberation. Registration will be available on the website soon, if it's not already, and we'll send out an email inviting you all to join us. So I hope you will be able to. But for now, it's time to bring our webinar to a close. Thanks so much, Jill.
Thank you.
Yeah, and for everyone else, farewell until we meet again.